The dust hung in the October air, thick and golden, tasting of dry corn stalks and diesel exhaust. It was 1973, and the fields of Black Hawk County, Iowa, were giving up their bounty. From the seat of my Massey Harris Super 92, the world was a rattling, rumbling symphony of old iron and honest work. The big Continental flathead six-cylinder engine hummed a steady, throaty tune right under my feet, a sound I knew better than my own heartbeat. Every groan of the belts, every clank of the gathering chains was a word in a language only a man who lived with his machine could understand. I gripped the worn wooden knob of the header control, easing the 3-row corn head into the stand. The stalks crunched as they were pulled in, the snapping rolls doing their work. It wasn't fast, not by a long shot. The Super 92 was a 1957 model, a relic from an era before air-conditioned cabs and stereo systems. My cab was the open sky. My air conditioning was the autumn wind. My music was the engine and the corn, and I was fine with that. I owned this machine, free and clear. Every bolt, every belt, every grease-stained fitting was mine, just like the 240 acres it was harvesting. A shadow fell over the rows to my left. It was a big shadow, a green shadow, and it moved with a speed that made my old Massey feel like it was standing still. It was Roger Peterson and his brand-new John Deere 7700 Turbo. The thing was a monster, a gleaming green behemoth that devoured 8 rows at a time. Through the tinted glass of his space capsule cab, I could see him sitting there in a clean shirt, one hand resting lightly on the hydrostatic lever, cool and comfortable as if he were sitting in his living room watching television. He'd bought it that spring, along with another 320 acres he'd picked up from the Miller estate. The loan he'd taken out at the bank in town was the subject of coffee shop gossip for a month. Some called him brave. I called him foolish. He finished his pass, the big 8-row head lifting effortlessly, and swung the machine around at the end of the field. Instead of starting his next pass, he shut down the separator and let the big diesel engine idle down to a deep, powerful thrum. He swung open the door of that quiet cab and hopped down. He was a young man, not yet 30, with the kind of soft hands that came from power steering and hydraulic controls. He strode across the turn row, his new work boots barely dusty, and stopped at the fence line that separated his land from mine. I saw him standing there and throttled the Massey down, pulling the separator clutch out. The sudden relative silence was filled with the ticking of the cooling engine and the chirping of crickets. I climbed down from the operator's platform, my knees aching from the day's work, and grabbed the red oil rag from my back pocket to wipe the grease and dust from my hands. "Earl," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. He leaned against a fence post, a confident smirk playing on his lips. "Making any headway with that old museum piece?" I didn't rise to the bait. "She's getting it done, Roger. Slow and steady." He chuckled, a sound that grated on my nerves. "Slow is right. Look, I'm not trying to tell you your business, but that stand of corn you've got is thick. Best I've seen in the county this year. You get a storm front move-in, and that little 3-row toy is going to leave you with half your crop on the ground." He gestured with his chin toward his silent green giant. "That combine won't handle this field, Earl. Not before the weather turns." I looked from my paid-for Massey to his mortgaged-to-the-hilt Deere. I saw the pride in his eyes, the certainty of a man who believes that new and shiny is always better. He thought my caution was fear. He thought my thrift was a weakness. He couldn't understand a man who didn't want to be in debt up to his eyeballs. "She's handled every field I've put her in for the last 15 years, I said, my voice flat. "This one's no different." 15 years ago, we weren't getting $4 a bushel, he shot back. "This is the time to get big or get out. You're leaving money on the table, tinkering with that old junk. You ought to go see the boys at the bank. They'd set you up right. The only time I like seeing a banker, Roger, is when he's waving goodbye to me from his front door after I've made my last payment. And that was a long time ago. He just shook his head, that pitying look on his face. Suit yourself, old man. Don't come crying to me when you're still out here picking corn in the snow. He turned and walked back to his machine, climbing into his quiet cab without a backward glance. A moment later, the big diesel roared back to life, and he was gone, disappearing in his own cloud of dust, harvesting more in one pass than I could in 3. I stood there for a long moment, the smell of his diesel exhaust mixing with the scent of my own. He wasn't entirely wrong. The corn was heavy this year, the best I'd ever grown, and the long-range forecast did mention a low-pressure system moving in from the west. A knot of worry tightened in my gut, but it was overshadowed by a deeper, harder feeling. It was resolve. That Massey Harris wasn't just a machine to me. It was a symbol of my independence. It was proof that a man could make his own way without owing his soul to the bank. Now, before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you folks watching this. Have you ever been in my shoes? Have you ever had someone with a brand new, financed to the hilt piece of equipment look down on your old, paid-for iron and tell you it wasn't good enough? What were you running? A Farmall H? An Alice Chalmers WD-45? A Ford A10? And what was he driving? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one. It's important to remember the machines that built this country, the ones that didn't come with a payment book as thick as a Bible. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I climbed back onto the operator's platform of the Super 92. I pushed the throttle forward, and the Continental engine responded with its familiar, honest roar. The gathering chains began to clatter, and the old combine lurched forward, biting into the corn once more. Roger could have his speed. He could have his quiet cab and his air conditioning. I had my freedom, and I was about to find out just what it was worth. 2 days later, Roger's words echoed in my head like a bad premonition. I was halfway through a pass on the back 80 when it happened. There was a loud bang, like a gunshot, followed by a high-pitched squeal and the sickening smell of burning rubber. The whole machine shuddered violently, and the header stopped dead in the stalks. I yanked the separator clutch and killed the engine in one practiced motion. The silence that fell was heavy and absolute. I sat there for a second, my heart pounding in my chest, and took a deep breath. Panic was a luxury a man in my position couldn't afford. I slid off the seat and climbed down, my boots sinking into the soft dirt. Smoke, thin and acrid, was curling out from behind the main drive shield on the left side of the machine. I knew before I even got the shield off what I'd find. The bolts were greasy and tight, but I always carried a 3/4-inch wrench in my pocket during harvest. After a minute of grunting and straining, the heavy steel shield came loose. The smoke billowed out, and the smell of burnt rubber intensified. There it was, the main separator drive belt, a massive, thick piece of layered rubber and canvas, had snapped. It lay in a tangled, shredded heap at the bottom of the drive housing, one end whipped around the main cylinder pulley so tight it looked like it had been welded there. I swore, a short, sharp word that was swallowed by the vast emptiness of the field. This was the belt that ran everything: the cylinder, the straw walkers, the cleaning fan, the whole guts of the machine. Without it, my combine was just a 10,000-pound paperweight. There was no running to the dealer for a quick fix. The nearest Massey Harris dealer had closed down 10 years ago. This wasn't a part you could just pick up at the local Napa. This was something special, something that would have to be ordered, if it could be found at all. And the clock was ticking. The sky to the west was a bruised, hazy grey, and the wind had a damp chill to it that it hadn't had that morning. The weatherman on the radio had upgraded that low-pressure system to a major autumn storm, talking about heavy rains and high winds arriving by the weekend. I spent the next hour wrestling with the remains of the old belt. It was a miserable job. The shredded end was wedged between the pulley and the combine's frame, and I had to use a long pry bar and a hammer to slowly, painstakingly work it free. Grease and black rubber dust coated my hands and arms, getting into my hair and the lines on my face. By the time I finally pulled the last piece free, my knuckles were scraped raw, and my back was screaming in protest. I threw the ruined belt onto the ground and stood up, surveying the problem. The pulley itself seemed undamaged, thank God. But I still needed a belt. I walked back to my pickup at the edge of the field, the broken belt slung over my shoulder like a dead snake. Back at the workshop, a place that smelled of old oil, damp earth, and hot metal, I laid the belt out on the concrete floor. I measured its length and width with a cloth tape measure, writing the numbers down on a dusty notepad with a carpenter's pencil. The first call was to a parts dealer in Waterloo. The man on the other end of the line just laughed. A main drive belt for a Super 92? Son, we haven't seen one of those in a decade. You might try a salvage yard. I spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone, the old black rotary phone in the shop, calling every salvage yard and implement dealer I could find in my tattered old phone book. The answer was always the same. Sorry, Earl, can't help you. Nothing that old in the yard. You might as well be looking for hen's teeth. With each call, the knot in my stomach tightened. I could feel the harvest slipping through my fingers. I imagined Roger finishing his fields, his big grain trucks rolling to the elevator, while my corn stood waiting for the wind and rain to flatten it. The scorn I'd seen in his eyes, the pity in his voice, it all came rushing back. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a stubborn old fool, clinging to the past while the world moved on. Dusk was settling in when I made my last call. It was a long shot, a number for a small, independent salvage yard 3 counties over, a place run by an old fella named Gus that I'd heard about, but never dealt with. The phone rang, and I was about to hang up when a gravelly voice answered. I explained my situation, expecting the same dismissal I'd gotten all day, but there was a pause on the other end of the line. Massey Super 92, you say? Gus grunted. Yeah, I remember those machines. Tough as a pine knot. Let me see. I got a 92 that came in here. Must be 8-9 years ago. Got wrecked in a barn fire. Most of it's scrap, but the fire was on the back end. Drive might still be good. A flicker of hope ignited in my chest. You think the belt's still there? And still good? Only one way to find out, he rasped. But I'm closing up for the night. Can't get to it till morning. The storm was supposed to hit the next evening. Gus, I said, my voice tight. I'll give you double what the belt is worth if you can have it for me by sunrise. I'll drive all night if I have to. There was another pause. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. You sound like you're in a real bind, friend, he finally said. All right. I got a couple of floodlights on the yard. Meet me here in 3 hours. And bring cash. I didn't even stop to wash my hands. I grabbed a fistful of bills from the coffee can where I kept my emergency money, jumped in my old Ford F100, and tore out of the driveway. The 3-hour drive was a blur of dark country roads and the steady drone of the truck's engine. My mind raced, picturing the belt, praying it was intact. This was more than just a repair now. It was a fight. A fight against time, against the weather, and against everyone who thought my ways were obsolete. It was a fight for my independence, and I wasn't going to lose. The salvage yard was a chaotic graveyard of iron, hulking shapes of dead tractors, and combines rising like tombstones under the stark glare of 2 floodlights. Gus was a short, barrel-chested man with hands like leather mallets and eyes that had seen a lifetime of broken machinery. He led me through the maze of rust to the back of the yard, to the blackened, twisted carcass of a Massey Harris Super 92. The fire had melted the tires and scorched the back half of the machine, but just as he'd said, the front end was mostly untouched, shielded by the grain tank. The drive housing was covered in soot and grime. Together with a long breaker bar, we fought the rusted bolts of the shield. When it finally came free with a groan of tortured metal, we shined a flashlight inside, and there it was. The belt. It was grimy and coated in soot, but it was whole. No cracks, no visible fraying. It was a small miracle. I paid Gus his money, my hand shaking slightly as I counted out the bills. He helped me load the heavy belt into the back of my pickup. "Good luck to you," he said, clapping me on the shoulder with a hand that nearly knocked me over. I always did like to see a man keep the old iron running. The drive home was fueled by adrenaline and black coffee from a thermos. I pulled into my yard just as the first hint of grey light appeared on the eastern horizon. There was no time to rest. I parked the truck next to the silent combine in the field and went to work. Getting the new belt on was 10 times harder than getting the old one off. It was a heavy, unwieldy thing, and I had to loop it over the main engine pulley, then thread it through the tensioners and around the big cylinder pulley, all while working in a cramped space filled with sharp metal edges. I had to use a pry bar to inch the belt onto the final pulley, my muscles straining with the effort. My hands, already scraped, were now bleeding from a dozen new cuts. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. Finally, with a last grunt of exertion, the belt slipped into place. I stood back, breathing heavily, my body screaming with fatigue. It looked right. I checked the tension, tightening the main idler pulley until the belt had just the right amount of give. I bolted the shield back on, my hands working with the sure, steady confidence of years of practice. The sun was fully up now, but the sky was a sheet of leaden grey. The wind was picking up, making the standing corn rustle and sway like a nervous crowd. I climbed onto the operator's platform, my legs feeling weak beneath me. I took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and turned the key. The starter ground for a moment, and then the big Continental engine coughed to life, settling into its familiar rumble. So far, so good. My hand trembled as I reached for the separator clutch lever. This was the moment of truth. I eased it forward. There was a slight chirp as the new belt grabbed, then the whole machine came alive. The cylinder began to spin, the straw walkers started their rhythmic dance, and the cleaning fan whirred. I listened, my ears straining for any sound of trouble, any squeal of a slipping belt or groan of a failing bearing. But all I heard was the sweet, powerful symphony of a working machine. A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. I engaged the header, lowered it into the corn, and pushed the throttle forward. The old Massey lurched ahead, and stalks began to disappear into its hungry maw. I was back in the fight. The next few years were good ones. The grain prices that had spiked in '73 stayed strong. The whole country seemed to be booming, and for farmers it felt like we'd finally turned a corner. Money was flowing. At the coffee shop, the talk wasn't about the weather or crop diseases anymore. It was about expansion. It was about buying the neighbor's 80, trading up to a bigger tractor, building a new harvester silo. The mantra was "Fensero to Fensero," and the banks were more than happy to fuel the fire, handing out loans with a smile. Roger Peterson was the poster boy for the new era. He was no longer just my neighbor, he was becoming an empire builder. The 320 acres he'd bought from the Miller estate was just the beginning. He bought another quarter section the following year, and then another. He traded in that old John Deere 71100 for a brand new 720 Titan II, a machine that made his last one look like a toy. It had a bigger engine, a bigger grain tank, and a state-of-the-art monitoring system in the cab that beeped and flashed lights. He built a new machine shed, a massive steel structure that dwarfed his house and barn. He bought a fleet of new grain trucks to haul his ever-expanding harvest. He was the king of Black Hawk County, and everyone saw him as the very model of success. He'd drive by my place in his new pickup truck, slowing down to look at my fields, at my old Massey parked in the shed, at my John Deere 40-20, a tractor I'd bought used with cash to replace my aging Farmall M. I could see the look on his face. It was a mixture of pity and contempt. To him, I was a fossil, a relic who was missing the gold rush. The other farmers saw it the same way. "Earl, you're sitting on a gold mine," one of them told me at the co-op, gesturing to my land. "Leverage it, man. You could double your acreage in a year." When I'd just shake my head and say I was happy with what I had, they'd look at each other and roll their eyes. They thought I lacked vision. They thought I was scared. They couldn't understand that what I valued wasn't the size of my operation, but the depth of its roots. Every dollar I made went into the bank or back into the farm, paying for seed, fertilizer, and repairs with cash. When the harvest was done, the money was mine. It didn't belong to a banker in a suit. I kept my head down and worked. I maintained my equipment with religious devotion. I replaced bearings before they failed. I changed the oil on schedule. I kept the Massey greased and sheltered. I treated my land not as a commodity to be exploited, but as a partner to be respected. My yields were consistently among the best in the county, a fact that seemed to irritate Roger, who was pouring thousands of dollars into every chemical and fertilizer the salesman could dream up. My success was a quiet rebuke to his philosophy of bigger, faster, more. One afternoon in the late 70s, I was at the parts counter at the dealership in town, picking up some filters for the 40-20. Roger came in, slapping the manager on the back, laughing loudly. He was signing the papers for a brand new four-wheel drive John Deere 8640. It was an articulated giant, a tractor so big it looked like it belonged on a construction site, not a farm field. He saw me standing there and sauntered over, the smell of new truck air freshener and easy credit clinging to him. "Still keeping that old two-cylinder popper running, Earl?" he asked, though he knew full well I ran a 40-20. "She runs just fine," I said, not looking up from my invoice. "You know," he said, leaning against the counter, his voice dropping to a confidential tone, "land prices are going to hit 4,000 an acre by next year. You're missing the boat. The bank would give you $1 million line of credit tomorrow, just on the equity you're sitting on. $1 million, Earl. Think about it." "I think about being debt-free, Roger," I said, finally looking him in the eye. "It's a feeling $1 million loan can't buy." He just laughed, that same condescending laugh from years ago. "You can't eat debt-free. You can't plant it. You can't harvest it. It's just a word. I'm building an operation that'll last for generations. You're just running a hobby farm." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be friendly, but felt like a dismissal. "You're a good farmer, Earl, just stuck in the past." He walked away to finish his paperwork, his laughter echoing in the big showroom. I paid for my filters in cash and walked out into the sunshine. But the air felt different. There was a change coming. On the truck radio on the way home, the news wasn't about grain prices anymore. It was about inflation, about an oil crisis in the Middle East, about interest rates, the prime rate, the number the banks based all their loans on, had been creeping up for months. It had gone from 6% to 8%, then to 10%. The announcer mentioned a man named Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, who was promising to whip inflation no matter the cost. That evening, I sat on my porch, watching the heat lightning flash on the horizon. The good times felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over deep, cold water. Roger and the others, they were skating on that ice, going faster and faster, convinced it would hold them forever. They didn't feel the creaks and groans beneath their feet. But I did. I was standing on the solid shore, and I could hear the cracking begin. A storm was coming, a different kind of storm than the one that had threatened my harvest years ago. This was an economic storm, and I had a feeling that no amount of horsepower or brand new paint could save a man from it if he was caught too far from shore. The first real sign of trouble came not from the sky or the fields, but from the chattering of the teletype machine at the co-op elevator. It was the summer of 1980. The papers were full of stories about American hostages in Iran, and President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union to punish them for invading Afghanistan. To a politician in Washington, it must have seemed like a clean, effective foreign policy tool. Out here in Black Hawk County, it was a gut punch. The price of corn, which had been climbing steadily for years, suddenly collapsed. The biggest buyer on the world market was gone overnight. The mood at the coffee shop turned sour. The talk of expansion and $4,000 land evaporated, replaced by nervous muttering about cash flow and operating notes. Men who had been slapping each other on the back a year ago now sat staring into their coffee cups, their faces etched with worry. They were leveraged to the hilt, banking on high prices to make their payments. Now, the floor had dropped out from under them. I saw Roger one afternoon that fall, standing beside his gleaming 717 Titan II at the end of a field. It wasn't running. The big 8-row corn head was half lifted, drooping at an awkward angle. A service truck from the John Deere dealership was parked next to it, and a young mechanic in a clean green uniform was elbow-deep in the machine's guts, tools spread out on a canvas tarp. Roger wasn't watching him work. He was staring out across his land, a vast expanse of corn that stretched to the horizon, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. I pulled my pickup over and walked across the ditch. "Trouble?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He startled, as if he hadn't heard me approach. "Ah, Earl," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just a little hiccup. The main hydraulic pump went out. Took the hydrostatic drive with it." He waved a dismissive hand at the complex tangle of hoses and valves the mechanic was working on. "They'll have it fixed in a jiffy. Just another new machine bug to work out." I knew what a main hydraulic pump cost for a machine that size. It wasn't a little hiccup. It was a repair that would cost more than my first tractor. And with the price of corn in the basement, every unexpected expense was a dagger. "Dealer part?" I asked. "Of course," he said, his old arrogance flaring for a moment. "Got to have the genuine article. They're flying it in from Moline. Be here tomorrow." Flying it in. I thought about the time I'd driven 3 hours in the middle of the night for a used belt, my hands greasy and my wallet full of cash I'd saved. Roger just made a phone call and put it on his line of credit at the dealership. But the look on his face told me he was thinking about the bill. He was thinking about the interest ticking away on that line of credit, interest that was climbing higher every day. "Well, hope you get it running soon," I said, and turned to leave. "Earl," he called out. I stopped. "That old Massey of yours, you ever have a breakdown that cost you $5,000? The question hung in the air between us. It wasn't a jab this time. It was a genuine question, laced with a dawning horror. "No, Roger," I said quietly. "I never have. The whole combine didn't cost me that much." I left him there, a silhouette against the setting sun, a king standing beside his broken chariot, beginning to understand the true cost of his kingdom. The cracks were showing, not just in his machinery, but in the very foundation of the world he had built. And the economic earthquake was just beginning to rumble. Paul Volcker's war on inflation had become a war on the debtor, and in the heartland, nearly every farmer was a debtor. The prime lending rate, which had been a sleepy single-digit number for most of my life, began a terrifying climb. 12%, 15%, 18%. It finally crested at a heart-stopping 21.5%. A variable rate loan, which had seemed like such a smart move when rates were low, was now a guillotine. The letters from the bank started arriving in mailboxes all over the county. They were cold, formal things, full of legal phrases that all meant the same thing. Pay up, or we're taking the farm. The first auction was for the old Henderson place, south of town. We all went, not to buy, but to bear witness. It was a grim, quiet affair. The auctioneer, a man I'd known my whole life to be full of jokes and good cheer, spoke in a somber, clipped tone. The neighbors stood with their hats in their hands, their faces grim, as another man's life was sold off, piece by piece. The big four-wheel drive tractor he'd bought just 2 years before sold for half of what he'd paid. There were too many tractors for sale, and not enough buyers with cash. After that, the auctions became a weekly occurrence. They were like funerals. You'd see families who had farmed the same ground for 100 years watch as the banker's hammer fell, scattering their heritage to the winds. The coffee shop fell silent. No one wanted to talk anymore. They just drank their coffee and stared out the window, wondering if their farm would be next. My farm was safe. My land was paid for. My machines were mine. The low grain prices hurt. There was no doubt about that. My income was a fraction of what it had been in the 70s. I tightened my belt, cut back on everything that wasn't absolutely necessary, and dipped into the savings I had carefully built up over the good years. I wasn't getting rich, but I was surviving. I was holding on. Roger wasn't. His empire, built on the sand of ever-increasing prices and easy credit, was crumbling. His operating loans were tied to that terrifying prime rate. The interest payments alone were more than most men's entire income. He sold off a quarter section of land at a loss just to keep the bank at bay for a few more months. Then another. He was selling his future to pay for his past. I saw him one day at the co-op. He looked 10 years older. The confidence was gone, replaced by a haunted, hunted look. He'd lost weight, and his work clothes, which had always been so new and clean, were worn and stained. He was loading sacks of feed into the back of his pickup, his movements slow and tired. He saw me watching him, and for a moment I thought he'd turn away in shame. Instead, he just nodded, a weary acknowledgement of our shared world, a world that was now treating us so differently. "Earl," he said, his voice raspy. "Roger." We stood there in an awkward silence, the sounds of the grain elevator filling the space between us. "Heard you had a good stand of beans this year," he said, making conversation. "They're not bad," I said. "Could have used a rain a few weeks back, but they'll make a crop." "Yeah," he said, staring at the ground. Mine are burning up. Didn't have the money for the herbicide I needed. The weeds are taking over. He kicked at a loose piece of gravel. The bank. They're calling my notes. All of them. He looked up, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, raw despair. I'm going to lose it all, Earl. Everything. There was nothing I could say. There were no words of comfort that wouldn't sound hollow or condescending. I just stood there and listened as the man who had once pitied me for my caution laid bare the ruins of his ambition. The notice for the Peterson farm auction appeared in the paper 2 months later. It was the biggest one the county had ever seen. Over 2,000 acres, a full line of nearly new John Deere equipment, the massive machine shed, the house, everything. The auction was to be held on a cold, blustery Saturday in November. The day of the auction, the sky was the color of steel. A bitter wind whipped across the harvested fields, rattling the bare branches of the trees. The lane leading back to Roger's farm was choked with pickups and cars. The crowd was huge, bigger than any I had ever seen. They were here to see the fall of a king. I found a spot near the back of the crowd, leaning against the fender of my truck. Roger's equipment was lined up in neat rows in the yard, polished and gleaming as if for a parade. The 8640 four-wheel drive, the 7 720 Titan II combine, the fleet of tractors and plows and planters. It was a breathtaking display of modern agricultural power, and it was all for sale. Roger was there, standing with his wife near the steps of their house. He looked like a ghost. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes vacant. He shook hands and accepted condolences like a man at his own wake. When his eyes met mine across the crowd, there was no animosity left in them. There was only a profound, bottomless sorrow. I gave him a slow nod, and he returned it. The auctioneer started with the small items, the tools and shop equipment. Then he moved to the machinery. The bidding was slow, hesitant. The prices were heart-breakingly low. Men were buying million-dollar operations for pennies on the dollar. I watched as the 7720, the machine Roger had been so proud of, the one that had replaced the combine he'd mocked me with, sold for less than the price of a new pickup truck. Finally, it was time for the land. It was sold in parcels. The home 80, with the house and the buildings, then the other parcels, one by one. I listened as the auctioneer's chant rolled across the silent crowd. When he got to the last parcel, I felt a nudge in my gut. It was the 320 acres from the old Miller estate, the land that bordered my farm, the very first piece Roger had bought in his quest for expansion. All right, folks, here it is, the last parcel of the day, the auctioneer called out. 320 acres of the finest black dirt in Black Hawk County. What'll you give me to start? The bidding started low. A few of the big operators from the next county were in on it, but their bids were cautious. No one had cash. No one could get a loan. I had spent the last week at the bank, not borrowing, but arranging. I was turning a decade of savings, a lifetime of careful management, into a cashier's check that was sitting in the inside pocket of my coat. The bidding stalled. The auctioneer tried to work the crowd, but the energy was gone. Folks, this is prime land. Are you going to let it go for that? He pleaded. I took a deep breath. The wind bit at my face. I thought of Roger's condescending laugh all those years ago. I thought of his haunted face just a few minutes earlier. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about being right. It was about the land. It was about a legacy of stewardship, not speculation. I raised my hand. The auctioneer's eyes locked onto mine. "I've got a new bidder," he shouted, his voice booming with renewed energy. The man next to me, a farmer from Rhinebeck, looked at me in disbelief. "Earl, you're bidding?" I just kept my eyes on the auctioneer and nodded when he looked for my next bid. The big operators tried to push back, but their hearts weren't in it. They were running on fumes. I was running on a foundation of solid ground. The bidding went back and forth a few more times, and then silence. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his hammer falling with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot. "To Earl Jensen." A murmur went through the crowd. A few of the old-timers came over and shook my hand, their eyes full of a new respect. "Well done, Earl," one of them said. "Glad to see it stay with a neighbor." I walked over to the clerk's table to sign the papers. As I was finishing, a shadow fell over me. It was Roger. He stood there for a long moment, not speaking. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Earl," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "You got the Miller place?" "I did," I said, folding my copy of the sales agreement and putting it in my pocket. "You're a good farmer," he said, his voice cracking. "You'll take good care of it." He looked out over the land, his land, now my land. I thought getting big was the answer. I thought new was always better. I borrowed every dollar they'd give me. I felt like a genius. He let out a short, bitter laugh. I was a fool. "You weren't a fool, Roger," I said, and I meant it. "You were just listening to a different song than I was. A lot of people were. It was a good song for a while." He looked at me, his eyes swimming with tears he refused to let fall. "What am I going to do now, Earl? I've got nothing left." I looked at the man before me. The arrogant young farmer was gone, stripped away by failure, leaving a humbled, broken man. I thought about the years of work ahead of me on my new land. "I'm going to need a hand," I said. "That's a lot of ground for one man to work, especially a man who's not as young as he used to be. The job pays a fair wage, and it comes with the old tenant house on the north corner of my home place, if you and your wife need a place to stay." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The offer was more than charity. It was a lifeline. It was a chance to stay on the land, to work the soil, to keep some small piece of his dignity intact. He finally just nodded, unable to speak, and wiped his eyes with the back of his rough hand. In the years that followed, the farm economy slowly healed. The prices came back a little. The interest rates fell. Roger worked for me for 5 years. He was the best hired man I ever had. He worked with a quiet intensity, a deep and abiding respect for the land he had once owned. We never spoke of the auction again. We didn't have to. The understanding was there in the way he maintained the equipment, in the way he walked the rows, checking the crops. He was relearning the lessons of the land, the ones that had nothing to do with balance sheets and depreciation. Eventually, he saved enough to rent a small farm of his own, a few counties away, and he made a new start, a smaller, wiser one. I kept farming, my operation now larger, but my philosophy unchanged. I bought a newer, bigger combine eventually, a used Gleaner N6 with an 8-row head. I paid cash, but I never got rid of the old Massey Harris Super 92. I kept it in the back of the machine shed, a monument of faded red paint and reliable iron. My son, Michael, came back to the farm after college. He had new ideas about computers and soil mapping, but he also had a deep respect for the old ways. He'd grown up watching the crisis unfold, watching his friends' fathers lose everything. He understood the value of a paid-for piece of ground. One crisp October afternoon, when Michael's own son, my grandson David, was about 10 years old, I pulled the old Massey out of the shed. It took some tinkering, a new battery and some fresh gas, but after a few tries, the old Continental Flathead 6 roared back to life, settling into its familiar, rumbling idle. I helped David up onto the operator's platform, his eyes wide with wonder. "This was your first combine, Grandpa?" he asked, his small hand resting on the big steering wheel. "This was the combine that saved the farm," I told him. I throttled it up and eased the separator clutch in. The whole machine shook and clattered to life, a symphony of old, honest steel. I drove it out to the edge of the cornfield, the same field that Roger and I had once harvested, on opposite sides of the fence line. I lowered the 3-row head and eased it into the standing corn. The stalks crunched, the gathering chains rattled, and golden kernels of corn began to fill the small grain tank. I looked over at my grandson. His face was lit up with joy, the dust and the noise and the vibration, a thrilling new world for him. "You see, David," I said, my voice raised over the engine's roar, "people will tell you that you need the newest, the biggest, the fastest thing to be successful. They'll tell you to borrow money, to take big risks, to get big or get out." I pointed to the machine around us. But this old combine taught me something different. It taught me that what you own is more important than what you owe. It taught me that slow and steady can win a race that you didn't even know you were running. He looked from my face to the corn pouring into the tank, then back to me, not quite understanding all the words, but feeling the weight of them. I let him steer for a little while, his small hands gripping the wheel as we moved slowly down the rows, the old machine doing the same work it had done for half a century. The sun was setting, just like it had on that day, so many years ago, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The dust hung in the air, thick and golden, tasting of dry corn stalks and diesel exhaust, and something more. It tasted of survival. It tasted of freedom. It tasted of a legacy, passed down not on a deed or a stock certificate, but in the rumble of an old engine and the wisdom of the land itself.